So not many teams around Major League Baseball can say they've been a bigger disappointment than the Oakland Athletics, but I think the New York Mets might be a close second, if not number one on the list. But now here, as we approach the deadline, reports are saying that Justin Verlander and Max Scherzer might be available. Bad idea? Good idea? Where are you standing on that one, Kyle?
Go for it, man. Those guys don't want to be there anymore. They are, I believe Buster only called them cautious sellers at the deadline right now, which is like the guys on the short-term contracts who they know are probably not coming back. They're ready to part with. I think you mentioned Marte, Tommy Pham, and Max Scherzer and Justin Verlander are both on the trade block at this point. And look, it makes sense for the Mets. The Mets are not going to make the playoffs at this point. Last time I checked, Fangraphs had them at like a 6% chance to make the playoffs. And that's just make the playoffs. That's not necessarily compete with the Braves, compete with the Dodgers. Those are the only two good teams in the National League, so compete with those teams. I think the Mets trading Scherzer and Verlander both make a whole lot of sense. And maybe it means that Steve Cohen wants to go the more traditional route of ownership and develop prospects and find value within the margins. Or maybe it's just clearing the books for another big free agent spending spree this offseason. I'm not quite sure exactly what the game plan is for them, but I mean, obviously the Mets are not good enough, and Scherzer and Verlander are both 40 years old. I feel like we don't talk about that enough. They are both 40-year-old pitchers.
Well, that was the risk.
Baseball.
That was the risk from the moment that they signed them both, like who gives I guess Scherzer at the time, 39, 38-year-old pitcher a multi-year deal. I guess if you're going to say anything positive about it, I think the Verlander deal still might be end up better for them than the DeGrom deal.
Yeah, but all of those teams are getting screwed on those deals. The good news for Texas is that they just mash home runs and will score 9 runs a game, so they don't even need Jacob DeGrom at this point. But yeah, the New York Mets probably would rather have Verlander than DeGrom at this point, but both of them are awful, awful contracts. And yeah, I think trading both of them makes a whole lot of sense for them. It's the same reason why San Diego is probably going to trade Blake Snell. They've kind of made the call that they weren't going to re-sign him. He's had an incredible contract year revival the last couple months, and now might be the time to strike while the iron's hot. You can sell and buy at the same time. And I think that's kind of where teams like the Mets and San Diego are right now. We sell the short-term pieces, but if a long-term asset comes available or a player who's under contract for multiple years, maybe we trade for him. Like, for example, say that the New York Mets trade Max Scherzer, and they trade Max Scherzer to the San Francisco Giants. Just as an example, you with your Giants hat on right now, let's say they trade Max Scherzer to the Giants, and then they take their farm system that they have and they flip some prospects, maybe some acquired in the Scherzer trade, maybe some otherwise, and flip their prospects for Shane Bieber. That would make sense. That would make sense because Bieber's still under contract going into next year. The Mets would love to sign him to a long-term extension. He's a little bit younger than where things stand with Max Scherzer and Justin Verlander. He might make a little bit less money per year than Verlander and Max Scherzer. So that would make all the sense in the world if the Mets are buying on a younger, long-term pitching option while also selling on the older guys who won't be there after next year. I could see the Mets buying and selling at the deadline, but the guys who are on short-term contracts who probably aren't going to come back next year, it behooves them to trade those players because they're not competing this year.
Out of disappointments in your life, where do you think kind of this Mets season kind of ranks? Is this one of the most disappointing teams of all time? There was World Series expectations on this team. There was, if this team gets into a 7-game series, I mean, you're rolling out Scherzer and Verlander at the top of your rotation. You should be set.
Yeah. Well, as someone whose baseball team, San Diego, beat the Mets in the wild card last year, I don't know exactly how scared I was of the New York Mets coming into the season, but they had the highest payroll in the history of baseball. I mean, for them to be worse than any Yankees team of the last 25 years is pretty incredible when you think about it in that context. They literally have a worse record than any Yankees team since 1994. I would say that is definitely a disappointment. Them selling at the deadline is a disappointment, but I think a lot of people are kind of resigned to the fact that they're selling at the deadline at this point. So I don't know exactly where the Mets kind of pivot from here. I mean, obviously they will have young players to trade if they trade Mark Canha and Tommy Pham and Max Scherzer and Justin Verlander. Obviously, if they trade those pieces, they will have some more flexibility going forward. But I don't think this is like the beginning of a teardown for the New York Mets or the beginning of them becoming the Anaheim Angels. I mean, Pete Alonso is under contract, I believe, for one more season, and I assume they want to keep him around long term. There's plenty of options in the pitching market they can go acquire. Even Marcus Stroman is going to be a free agent at the end of the season. If they want to bring him back to New York, that would make a whole lot of sense. There's a lot of different options for the Mets to work with. I don't think selling is necessarily the end of the world. It's just being honest about where you stand at this point. But in terms of a disappointment, I mean, how could you not be disappointed given what was being promised at the start of the season by Stevie Cohen and the Mets?
How does this reflect on Cohen? Cohen has built himself up as the top owner over the last couple of years in terms of like his willingness to go out there and spend and make an exciting product. And the Mets are, not exciting or contending. So it just seems like wasted money by Cohen at this point.
Yeah, but I'm not going to tell him to stop wasting his money. Keep wasting your money, my friend. One of my favorite quotes ever is when they put in the fourth luxury tax penalty for baseball, and they basically called it the Steve Cohen tax. Steve Cohen had a quote when asked about it saying, "It's better than having a bridge named after you," which is just an absolutely badass quote by Steve Cohen. Stevie, keep spending your damn money. Now, I understand that the reason he's able to do this, other than being worth $18 billion, is he's leveraging the value of the franchise that he just purchased against the value of the team. And after about 5 years, you're kind of on your own in terms of like, you get a bump from baseball when you first own the team because you're taking the money out against the value of the team. There's a whole thing behind it that's boring and not important, but like you have 5 years to kind of spend a whole bunch of money. It's the same thing the Padres guy is doing. After about 5 years, you're kind of on your own in terms of like, here's the money you make and here's the money you can spend. So maybe Stevie Cohen decides to be boring owner trying to turn a profit after a few years. But my hope is that by selling at the deadline, it will then turn around and Stevie Cohen can sell or can buy even more players and try this whole strategy again with the New York Mets, because just because it didn't work out this time doesn't mean you can't trade all the players and try again. That's my hope, at least for Stevie Cohen, is that he goes and tries to do the same thing over again. And again, we'll finish second place to the Braves in the National League East.
Well, third place. I mean, can't forget about those fighting Phillies. But
all right. But the Mets can catch the Phillies. Not this year, but the Phillies are not this. Like, the Phillies are not in the playoffs right now. I'm not going to say the Phillies are this giant force that is impossible to catch. No, the Phillies are kind of mid. The Nationals they can catch them.
If Reese didn't get hurt, maybe they would even have a little bit more of a boost.
They could end up being in the playoffs at the end of this whole thing, but it's not like the Phillies are this dominant force that is uncatchable in the National League East. The Phillies are like the seventh best team in the National League. And like I said earlier, there's like two good teams in the National League this year, maybe a third, depending on how you feel about the Diamondbacks. But
hey, don't forget about the Marlins, man. Come on. Also got to give them some up in the East.
Well, I don't know if you checked in recently. The Marlins have lost 8 games in a row, so they are out of the playoffs now, and
still not as disappointing as the Mets.
That is fair. That is fair. The Marlins are now worse than the Phillies, and I just said the Phillies were uncatchable. But hey, you know what? Maybe the San Francisco Giants will. Maybe the Giants will win a playoff series this year. Like I said last week, someone has to fuck around and lose to the Braves in the NLDS. Why can't it be the Giants? Fuck around and get smoked in 3 games by the Braves. Why not? There's only 2 good teams in the National League this year, and the Mets are one of the bad ones. So the New York Mets are going to probably trade some of those big players. Tommy Pham would be great for a team like Baltimore, which, God, could you imagine saying at the start of the year, Baltimore is going to buy players from the Mets? The team with like the 25th highest payroll in baseball is going to be buying from the Mets. That would be insane. Also, if there's a team in baseball right now that desperately needs a starting pitcher because they only have 2 and their other guys have been hurt, and you think they're about a top end starting pitcher away from being able to compete for a championship, like I don't know, say the Houston Astros, and they might need a pitcher like a Justin Verlander. Wouldn't that be a perfect match of sorts to kind of put those 2 back together?
Was just thinking about that this week. Might be a perfect landing spot right there. But all right, I'll leave it up to baseball fans, Mets fans, whoever is in the comment section. Where do you think players like Verlander and Scherzer end up? What about players like Lindor, Starling, Marte? Do they end up on other teams? Leave a like in the video, subscribe to the channel, follow us on all our social medias. From Juju and Kyle, stay safe, happy, and healthy. We'll see you next time.